everybody, welcome to the next week of Gender, Race, and Media. Let's talk about comics and superheroes. Comics and superheroes and these kinds of things, these kinds of popular culture artifacts, to discuss more broadly issues of gender and race and associated ideas and terms. So this week is really about how superheroes migrated from, well, I guess you could say, and it depends on how you define it, right? But you could say like cave paintings, ancient folklore, to an important point, at least in American popular culture, which was the comics, the pulps first, which were the written magazines, and then the comics, which were mostly, sequential art, in the early part of the 20th century. So by the 1930s, you have Superman and Batman, and Wonder Woman comes after that. And so you have these heroes, and they gain popularity, and I want you... I've just recorded 2 other videos, so I'm not going to spend too much time because my voice is getting tired. It's too bad we couldn't meet in person today, but anyway, we'll talk soon. I have a very special guest for us coming up soon. I have a few special guests, actually. So anyway, I just want to get some of the basic ideas out of this reading, and you're welcome to email me. You're welcome to start thinking about how you might apply this, because again, we'll talk in the future, but you are going to do somewhat similar work yourself, as a group or as an individual for your assignments. But in this case, I want you to think about the things that were going on in parallel to the trajectory of these superheroes. So when these superheroes came onto the scene, women had just really gotten the right to vote. Civil rights was not even a thing yet, really, when Superman and Batman entered the stage. So, funny enough, there are no black people in the early Superman and Batman. We can talk about how that fits together and how the early comics represent the world, not necessarily as it is, because obviously it's not the same, but it can be read sort of as a symptom of the world. And it can also influence that world. So when I say the world, I mean, our society, the way we interact, the way we are organized. And so in that case, American capitalism, war, the First World War, and then the Second World War, when comics really kind of took off. They got sent overseas, the American-style comics, because there were British and Japanese-style comics as well, right? But the American comics, which became very popular with superheroes, you have the DC Universe, and then what became the Marvel Universe started to appear. These were going in tandem with certain events in our culture, right? So women being allowed more access to the job market, to the world stage. America still hasn't had a female president, but there were more and more political representation from women. Again, the right to vote was a new thing. Think about that as a new thing. So you do get certain places like Wonder Woman where you can see more powerful women, but again, dominated by men, the superhero world, dominated by white, cis men. Then you start to get differences. So in the 50s, you have this fear that goes hand in hand with McCarthyism. So like the Americans were scared that communists would infiltrate them, and so they started blacklisting people, especially Jews, especially anyone from like Eastern Europe and stuff that might be communist or communist sympathizers. It was a scary time because if you were outed as a communist sympathizer, you might not get a job, you might not be able to interact with people you'd want to. It was kind of the opposite of like the American way, the freedom that we speak about. So during that time, comics also became very closed in because of fears that it was corrupting youth, that it was doing all these bad things. And so they became horrible. I mean, you could argue and debate, you don't have to agree with me, but they really closed in on what they covered. Then in the 60s, 70s, and 80s especially, they started to grow in terms of what they covered. And so you have issues like drug use, rape, criminality that disappeared for a while, and also issues of race and gender start to really appear. It's not to say that we didn't have issues of race and gender in America earlier, but they weren't covered. And then in the 70s in particular, and then definitely in the 80s with the British Wave they talk about, and these really important comics that came out. Then you have stuff like Mouse, you have stuff like The Watchmen, you have V for Vendetta, you have a bunch of things that are really interesting. I won't get too into it, all the details, and I won't get too nerdy, but I will say that when I realized comics were really cool and important was when a friend of mine in Toronto gave me V for Vendetta and The Watchmen, and both were great. But in V for Vendetta, you don't know who's behind this Guy Fawkes mask, and you know that this person at some point was in a camp, like the Nazis. I can't remember if it was like an actual Holocaust thing or if it was just similar, but this person you know was persecuted, but you don't know why. So this person might be a gay man, might be a minority, a racial minority, might be a woman who spoke out against, like went above and beyond what she was allowed to do, right? It might be any of those things. In a film, you have to hear the voice, and so you can't say that V is a woman because he has a male voice, right? It's actually the actor who is the guy in The Matrix, right? The guy in The Hobbit, I think, or Lord of the Rings. Anyway, Agent Smith. So you have to give that information if you're making an audio-visual recording. You don't have to give that information if you're doing a comic. So you don't know how the person sounds, and they don't have to tell you. So it could be a woman, it could be a man, could be a black person, could be a white person, could be whatever, right? So there's just this mask, which is also kind of the image for the class, this mask, because as we continue to talk about race, gender, sexuality, all these things are kind of masks metaphorically that we put on, because then we act like men, or we act like we think white people should act. And you might be saying to yourself, well, I'm a white guy, but I don't act like I think a white guy should act. And yeah, you do. You just don't necessarily consciously think about it, right? We're still putting on these masks. They just are not as obvious as, a literal mask. And so the comics help us unpack some of that, because you have artists, as the reading points out, a lot of young Jewish immigrants, young men, were doing these comics. They worked really hard on these. They did things like Superman, and you can see the similarities, right? Superman was put basically in a basket, a space basket, and sent down a space river, really, right? Like Moses. You have Thor, who was literally a god already and was converted into comics form. There are all these cases in which you have clear inspiration. Maybe it's from the Holocaust and that experience, or maybe it's from earlier times, like earlier folklore or mythology or religious convention. And then you build on that and you start to question things. So then you have things like The Watchmen that asks, like, who watches The Watchmen? What is it that we should be thinking about? Would we blindly follow these characters, or would they have flaws too? And these kinds of ideas might sound familiar to us now when we look at politicians or anyone really in power, and we ask ourselves, is this person flawed, and in what way? And so it reflects our society, right? So suddenly we have more women characters than ever before in comics and in the superhero world. That reflects not that there are more women in our world, but that women are getting more of a voice than they used to in our world. And that's a clear reflection of reality, but it also helps push that reality, right? So maybe young women see Wonder Woman on screen, and then they think to themselves, maybe I shouldn't aim lower than I was, because if Wonder Woman can do this thing, maybe I can do this thing too, right? And so then you actually have changes in the real world, or maybe men who used to think, women aren't as good as us or whatever, suddenly see more and more representations, and then they question less the idea of a woman leader or boss or whatever the case, right? So there's this back and forth between the fictional world and our real world, to the point where you can't necessarily distinguish them. But the important thing I want you to think about, the most important thing, is how things going on in the world. So the Second World War didn't make comics, but it allowed people, especially the young men who went out to war, to get these heroes that they could read in the trenches or in their bunkers or whatever, and they could be inspired by them. And so they clearly built on that as they went. And then those people got older, more mature. Comics also got more mature as time went by, and then you get new generations. And then you get new questions like issues of feminism, of black power, gay liberation. These things start to enter the sort of mainstream comics world as they enter the mainstream discourses in America. So then think about things like Black Panther, more recent issues, like I said, Wonder Woman, the debates that have gone on in our world, like in our actual political system and things like that, and the debates that are going on in Civil War, for example, a Marvel story where mutants are told that they need to register, right? That seems obviously like certain other things going on. Superman as an immigrant has become a big vocal issue with anti-immigrant sentiment in the US, pointing out that if Superman represents the American way and is an immigrant, maybe we shouldn't be so mean to immigrants in our foreign policy and stuff like that, right? So you get all this going back and forth, and that allows us to better understand both, which is why I think most people who study comics or superheroes or whatever often say, as you know, that they do in this reading that I gave you this week, it's not so much the comics or the superheroes, it's what they say about bigger issues. And so how do you see those bigger issues yourself in your reading, and how might you start to study whatever it doesn't have to be a superhero in a traditional sense, but you are going to study somebody, a representation, you're actually going to make your own in the future. How do those discourses work? How do we negotiate them? That's what I want you thinking about. I look forward to discussing this, which is what I want to do, with you, and we'll do that soon. In the meantime, I hope you get a lot out of the reading so far, and that you continue to think about it, and that you continue to ask good questions. Talk to you soon.